Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Feedstuffs webinar, Managing Mycotoxins, Reduce Negative Effects on Swine Production. The webinar is sponsored by dsm-firmenich and broadcast by Informa and Feedstuffs. I'm Sarah Muirhead, and I will be your moderator here today. Before we get started, we have just a few announcements that we want to walk through. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive, and there is a docket of widgets there at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar, and most importantly, participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically today throughout the event, so you don't need to worry about pushing any buttons. Today, towards the end of our webinar, you will be asked to complete our survey. And we do ask you to take just a minute to fill that out before leaving us, as your feedback does provide us some very valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click on the help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or you can type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. Now, on to the presentation, Managing Mycotoxins, Reduce Negative Effects on Swine Production. Discussing today's topics are Dr. Lan Zheng, Technical Service Manager at dsm-firmenich, Dr. Merlin Lindemann, Professor, Animal Food Science at University of Kentucky, and Deanne Schatzmayr, Program Director, Mycotoxins at dsm-firmenich. To learn more about our speakers, as I mentioned before, check in the widgets below. So, Lan, over to you to click things off, start things off here, please.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm very excited to share with you the mycotoxin survey. Our company has been doing this survey for 20 years in North America region. We upload the survey every month on our website. Today, I'm going to share the most recent March mycotoxin survey. So we screened 220 corn from 19 states. All of the samples were analyzed by the Romer labs using LC-MS technique. It's a broad analysis measuring 6 mycotoxin family, including 18 mycotoxins. I'd like to point out that as of August 2023, the lab implemented an updated testing method called PLUS method. So this new method has a lower limit of detection. So we were able to detect a low level toxin more than what we did in the past. Zearalenone and type A trichoxisins are the most impacted two toxins. And I'll explain that more in the later slides. So looking at the occurrence of the major mycotoxins among the 220 corn samples that we screened, so far to date, 94% came back positive, meaning the corn contained at least one mycotoxin. And the most prevalent toxins are fumonisins, zearalenone, type B trichoxin, mainly deoxynivalenol, DON, followed by type A trichoxisins, T2 and HD2, and aflatoxins. The aflatoxin level was really minimum, less than 1%. So let's look at the top 5 over the 6 years period. Aflatoxins remained the same this year from last year. 11% samples contained aflatoxins. And there was a slight increase in fumonisins compared to last year, 79 to 83. We have a lower occurrence of DON compared to the previous years, and the type A trichoxin, your T2 and HT2 toxins has increased from 3 to 19%, and this is mainly due to the new testing method, the enhanced sensitivity. And in the same fashion, zearalenone was increased to 73% because of the increased sensitivity of the new method. If some of you are joining right now and seeing this dramatic increase, no need to worry about. It's mainly due to the testing method. And those values are an average number We do see some spikes in fumonisin and deoxynivalenol in some areas this year. So looking at the average contamination level, the unit is parts per billion. To give you a perspective, it is equivalent to a grain of sand in an about 50 pounds of bag. So we're looking at a really small amount of mycotoxins. The levels highlighted in red is the level we generally consider as high for pigs. And we looked at maximum level of each toxin to give you an idea what range you are looking at. So aflatoxin level is lower than last year. We're seeing a really high maximum level, 157 parts per billion. And the average of the fumonisin has been above the 2000 parts per billion, the risk level. We had the highest average last year, and this year's is close to 2020 and 2021. We're finding levels up to 48 parts per million, which is really high in some of the areas. And this year's DAWN average is the highest compared to the last 5 years, although the occurrence we saw in the earlier slide was lower, but the contamination is high. And we have the maximum level about 19 parts per million. The T2 and HT2 toxin average is similar to the last year's level, but we do see high maximum level, 300 parts per billion. Zearalenone have been above threshold 100 parts per billion, and this year's lower than the previous year's. Maximum level we are seeing is 1900 parts per billion, which is really high for pigs. And looking at the risk level by state, this provides you state basis information and regional differences, but please keep in mind that there are some hotspots within the same state. The red color represents states with average above the high-risk threshold. In this case, it's 20 parts per billion for aflatoxin. Yellow represents states below the threshold, and the dark gray represents states below the limit of detection, so no mycotoxins were detected. And the light gray represents states that we don't have any samples submitted so far. In the table on the right, we listed the states in the order of the highest to the lowest contamination in parts per billion. And we break them down into the number of samples collected from each state and the positive percentage. The top ranking state is Georgia, but there's only 2 samples came in and half was positive. As full disclosure, we listed all the information for you. And Missouri is the next highest, 39 samples came in, 26 was positive for aflatoxin. If we collected more samples from the southern states, we might be seeing more red colors on the map. And the color scheme for the type B tricoxazine, mainly DAWN, is the same. The only change is the risk threshold, and that applies to the rest of the toxins. The leading state for DAWN is Ohio. The average is close to 6,000 parts per billion. Florida showed up as the second highest, but it's only a few samples from that state. And we've been seeing the high DAWN from the Great Lakes states the past few years, and it's continuing to be a challenge from those states. Fumonisins are more prevalent in a warm and dry climate. Historically, states in the southern regions have had higher fumonisins than the northern states. This year, so far, Colorado is actually leading. We have 10 samples from Colorado state. All of them tested positive. And next is Missouri, 39 samples, almost all of them tested positive. And this year we're seeing fumonisins pretty much from all of the states where we have samples from. And this trend is similar to last year. Zearalenone is a similar pattern with DAWN. It prefers cool climate condition, a wide range of contaminations from different states. As you can see, this toxin usually present with other toxins like deoxynivalenol, DAWN, and fumonisins. So states like Ohio, we saw earlier, had the highest DON, and it's ranking third for zearalenone. For type A tricoxazins, T2 and HD2, Minnesota and Michigan are the top two highest states because they prefer the colder climate. So we see this toxin group more often in the Canadian corn. The co-occurrence is one of the most concerning things when we look at mycotoxins. The red line indicates samples contain more than one mycotoxin, and the yellow line indicates samples contained one mycotoxin. 78 samples contained more than one mycotoxin, which has increased from last year and is similar to 2018 to 2019, where we had some challenging years. Looking at the profile of that co-occurrence, starting from the right, 55% samples contain more than two toxins. So more than half of the samples we analyzed contained greater than two toxins. And if we look at which mycotoxins are showing together, 32% was the three fusarium toxins, the combinations of type B tricoxazins, fumonisins, and zearalenone. And if we look at the samples at two mycotoxins, the darker orange area, we had 24% samples contained two mycotoxins, and the most common combination was fumonisin and zearalenone, followed by the type B tricoxazins and fumonisins. And 15% had single toxin, the fumonisins, and interestingly, either DON or zearalenone appeared alone. To summarize, the 2023 harvested corn collected thus far shows higher occurrence when we compare to 2022 harvested corn. 94% tested positive for at least one mycotoxin, and is increased from last year percentage, 92%. And samples contained more than one toxin has increased from last year, 69 to 78%. So approximately 8 out of 10 samples came back more than one toxin. So the survey results suggest a continued risk by the three fusarium toxins, type B tricoxazins, mainly DON, fumonisins, and zearalenone, and it emphasizes the importance of risk mitigation that is effective for multiple mycotoxins. With that, I thank for your time listening. I'll hand it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Lan. Thank you for sharing those results, the mycotoxin survey results. If you have any questions, please post those in the Q&A window. Now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Merlin Lindemann, and he's going to share with us some recent research results. Over to you, Merlin.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone who's on the webinar. I appreciate you being here today, and I'm happy to be here and share some of the results of our work at the University of Kentucky. I will be using the pointer a lot because there is data and points on the slides that I'll not be talking about. This presentation will be available, or conference proceeding that includes all of this information plus some additional information will be available after the webinar. So if you desire to look further at the information, you will have that opportunity. All right, we all know that mycotoxins are secondary metabolites that, when ingested, can cause a wide variety of adverse physiological responses. Excuse me. Those responses are, of course, time and dose dependent, whether you have an acute insult, high levels for a short period of time, or a chronic level insult, lower levels for extended period of times. And those symptoms are species and dose dependent. Now, in addition to having the species and dose dependency issues, you have the issue of additivity, antagonism, and synergism. This is additivity if you have two mycotoxins each of which may give a 10% reduction. You put them both in the diet or they're both present, you get a 20% reduction in performance. That makes a lot of sense. 10% with this one and 10% with that, well, we get 20%. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get a synergism. Synergism, we got two bad toxins together where 10% reduction from either one of them, but if both put in the diet, you may have a 30 or 50% reduction. It's just a bad combination of toxins. Now, interestingly, there is a situation called antagonism where you put those two together and you don't get as bad an effect as you expect. So whenever you have multiple mycotoxins in your corn, how can you tell which mycotoxin is giving you what degree of effect? If you have a loss of performance, is that 30%? We'll be looking at a study here with 3 mycotoxins. Is the loss of performance a third from each of them? Or does one of them is responsible for 90% and the other 2 very little? It is difficult to tell when you're just looking at the total body weight gain or loss of growth. It's impossible to do unless there is a specific biomarker unique to each of the mycotoxins. And fortunately, that is the case with the mycotoxins that we'll be talking about today. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the effects of screening corn because we got our bad toxins by using some corn fines screened out of corn from a particularly bad year at the University of Kentucky. I'm responsible for the feed mill at the University of Kentucky. And if you look across from 2016 to 2022, just some years that we've put up there, you see 2019 was a pretty good year. Low levels of fumonisin B1, we couldn't detect any of these next 2 toxins. And deoxynivalenol is the lowest number on this particular chart, other than 2022 when none was detected. 2020 was a really bad year for us. That's the highest levels of fumonisin B1. It was the highest level of B2, and it was the highest level of deoxynivalenol. Extremely bad year. So what we did is we put the corn through a grain cleaner. You've got the cleaned grain. Clean is in quotes there. I'll show you some results in a little bit. And then you got the fines or the tailings. So here's the limit of detection for these 4 mycotoxins that we looked at that year. The grain as it existed uncleaned is listed here, 2,000 parts per billion of fumonisin B1, 1,300 of deoxynivalenol. When we run it through the grain cleaner, this cleaned grain is not really totally devoid of mycotoxins. It's still there. But obviously, these numbers are a lot lower. Some of them, such as fumonisin B2, is below the limit of detection. There's still a little bit there, but it's low enough we can't even detect it. And then we get the fines, the 2 to 3% that we have screened off, and that's really hopped up in toxin levels. Now, if you're on the farm, you could decide to dispose of that or give it to a species that is less susceptible, or you could still find value in it. Now, for a researcher such as myself, instead of disposing of that, that's exactly what I want to feed to some poultry and pigs. And I want to see what's going to happen if I use increasing levels of fines and of the associated mycotoxins. So we're going to look at our first study of increasing graded levels of the fines containing these 3 mycotoxins up to the FDA cautionary levels that they have published in various publications. Now again, look at the bullet, don't follow the other stuff. We've got the 3 mycotoxins listed here. And in this study, we looked at a potential mitigant. Boron, work out of Romania said it would be of value. We did not find any value in it, and I'm not going to talk about it on the slides, but it will be there. And if you're interested, you can request the proceedings after this presentation. From this first study, we did both a growth performance test, that we'll see in the second set of data, as well as a feed preference test, where we offer these pigs two of the two diets and let them tell us which they prefer, if in fact they are able to detect differences between the diets. So here's our very simple diet composition, about 60% corn and 35% for our protein, vitamin, mineral supplements, and anything else. In the diet, which we've got here is diet 3, we'll be first talking about diets 1, 2, and 3. We've got 20% fines in there. Diet 2 is half of diet 1 and 3, 10% fines. We do not mix all the diets. We mix the high and low, and then we blend them to get the intermediate level, so we know where we are exactly half or 1/3 or 2/3 of the way, whatever our target is. These are the mycotoxin levels of the diets that were used. The cleaned corn, so this is clean, that has gone through the screener. We've still got mycotoxin levels there, but not as much as the corn fines that we have. Now, you can just look at, the easiest diet to look at is the 10%. Let's look here at the fumonisin B1, 10%. 10% of the corn fines of 16,000 would be about 1,600 in some. We're measuring 1,700. These things are not exact, but you can see that we are stepping right up from diet 1 to diet 2 to diet 3. We are increasing. That's the beauty of blending the diets, is even if our assays are a little up, a little down, we know that that intermediate diet is halfway between them. All of these values are subject to lab variation, subject to our sampling variation, all of that occurs when measuring either nutrient levels or toxin levels. So the swine cautionary levels are right here. So for deoxynivalenol, level is 1,000, we hit 1245, so we're right at that. For zearalenone, that's 500, and we're a little below that. And if we add the 3 levels of the fumonisins here, we're a little over 4,000, so we're slightly below the cautionary level here. But we're basically right at the cautionary level that the FDA would say. Here's a preference study. Don't worry about the number of pigs. Again, you can look at that later. In the comparison 1, we're looking at diet 1, which is 0% fines compared to 10% fines. Comparison 2 is 0% fines compared to 20% fines, our highest level. And then finally, we've got 10% versus 20% fines. We're going to look first at comparison number 2. They are the most divergent treatments, 0% fines compared to 20% fines. What we see there is after 3 weeks, the pigs have said 75% of the diet they consume is 0%, and 25% of the total diets consumed is the 20% fine diets. When we give them this choice, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we change the feeder location. So it's not a situation where a pig is just accustomed to eating on the left-hand side or right-hand side of the pen. If they know the difference between diets, they've got to follow the feeder. And the pigs have shown they can do that. Very strong differentiation. And Barrows had a stronger favoring of the control diet over the 20% fines than did the gilts. Barrows have been shown to be more sensitive to DON, the vomitoxin, deoxynivalenol. Excuse me. And that was shown here. So very strong discrimination against the 20% fines. Now we're going to look at 0 versus 10%. Remember, 75, 25. But a 0 versus 10%, the pigs only, the discrimination is not as strong. It's 60% control, 40% of the 10s. We've lost our statistical significance, but because I know from the previous slide I showed you that they do tell the difference and are discriminating against the 20% diet, I believe these numbers are real. They are simply not enough replication to have the statistical significance. But I believe that is true based on the previous slide. Now we're going to go to 10 versus 20% on this study. So 10 versus 20. And we again have about the 75 to 25 ratio. So 75% being the 10% diet, 25% of the consumption being the high fine 20% diet. So that's almost the same as the first one of 0% fines versus 20. So they're not actually favoring a diet as much as they are disfavoring, if you would. They're discriminating against that 20%. Once you hit that level somewhere between 10 and 20%, or the toxins for that level of fines, which you can calculate, then they're saying, I do not want to eat that diet, I want the other one. And again, now we have our significance here. The barrows are clearly discriminating against it. Guilt's a little bit, but not statistically so. So the story is quite complete. They can tell the difference between the diets. They can follow the feed and the feeder. They know what they're consuming. So now we're going to look at the performance study. Diets 1 through 3 are just those same ones that we had, the very same mixture, the same batch brought up to the nursery. And then we have diets 4 through 6, which is, again, the very same diets, but with the boron. I have one slide with data on it, but I'm not going to talk about the data. I'm simply going to use it to make a point. All right, let's look at our growth here. 0, 10, and 20%. 0.72 dropping down to 0.69. Not statistically significant, but is it real? Well, here's where I look at the other 0, 10, and 20, these three numbers here, 0.7, 0.71, 0.68. The 0.71 is higher than the 0.70. You know, it's not different, but it just tells you that I don't believe the previous one over here where it was a little lower. You average those 0, 10, and 20%, and it's flat line. There is no difference in performance when they do not have a choice. If you give them a choice, they will demonstrate a selection of the diet with less of the toxins. But if you don't give them a choice, at least up to these levels, they were not changing performance. So in summary of this first study, pigs can differentiate between diets containing mycotoxins, but the pigs did not show decreased performance at the concentration of the mycotoxin in this study. So now we're going to go on. Since any kind of change in performance, any improvement or any detriment is going to be time and dose related. Because we didn't see any effect in the first study, we've got to go to an increased dose or increased time. And that's what we do in this particular study. So we've got the same three mycotoxins up here. This time we're adding in another potential mitigant, and that's a Biofix Plus with fumonisins. I'll mention a little bit about that, and then our next speaker will say even more. And we're simply going to look at growth performance in this particular presentation. I am not going to look at all the clinical chemistry that we measured. We measured a lot of things to see if there was differences in a specific blood indicator. But with regard to fumonisins and fumonisins, there is a unique biomarker. Fumonisins affect the sphingolipid-sphingosine ratio. We will measure that, and we will show you what that is. That will give us a very clear indication of what percent of the performance reduction that we do see in this study is related to the fumonisins and our ability to recover that lost performance. So diet 1 through 4 is now, instead of 0, 10, and 20 in the previous study, now we're 0, 20% as the previous study, but we've upped it. We're going to 40 and 60% total corn fines. We're going to hit them pretty hard and see if we can slow them down. And we're going 6 weeks on study rather than 3 weeks as we had previously. So fumonisins is FDA approved for both swine and poultry to reduce the general negative effects of fumonisins on the liver, immune system, gut integrity, and general performance. With some mycotoxins, there are things that you can do that break that toxin somewhat. Aflatoxins are one. You can break it with certain procedures, but when it gets to a different part of the intestinal tract, it reconnects and you have it again. So it doesn't help you a long time. With this particular enzyme, it is a irreversible detoxification of the fumonisins. They do not reform. So here's our diets. Diet 1, 60% of the clean corn. Diet 4, 60% of the corn fines. A total replacement of clean corn with corn fines. The common diet, we'll not talk about it. We did out of a 2-week period after this study to see what happens when they come off these diets and are just put on a good diet. So our levels of mycotoxins in these diets. Diet 1, we still have some mycotoxins. Diet 4, we have highest level of mycotoxins. And as we proceed from diet 1 to diet 2 to diet 3 to diet 4, we are stepping up. As I said before, we mix the high and the low and then we blend them. So those numbers may not be exactly 1/3 or 2/3 of the way, but that is exactly 1/3 and 2/3 of that diet 4 diet. Also, diets 5 and 6. Diet 6 is the only one we're concerned about, the fumonisins. That was diet 4 with the product added to it. So it is the very same diet coming out of the very same mixer, and we just take a portion of it and add the fumonisins. So you look at these two diets with the two mitigants, they're lower than the diet 4. They're lower based on a single assay. Those are not different numbers. You can look down here, and here those numbers are not really different. They're both a little lower than this, but I just make that point that this diet is exactly the same as diet 4. It's just that when we analyze for the mycotoxins, we got the sampling issues of variation in sampling and where we got the sample and is it uniform? And then you got some lab variations. So just make the point, those are the same diets. All right, now let's look at daily gain. Weeks 1 through 6, we were gonna hit them as hard as we could. What we've got with no fines is 0.62. With 20%, no decrease in performance. That's just like the first study. So these pigs are acting the very same way. 40% fines, nothing. 60% fines, now we've slowed them down. So we got a high enough dose for a long enough period of time, we've slowed them down. Now let's look at 60% fines with fumonisins. We're pulling back toward the control. For those that understand statistics and want to look at it, here we have a superscript A, and here we have a superscript B. Those are significantly different. We've got 70 grams per day difference in performance. We're able to bring it back to where they are no longer different. It's both A and B here. We recover 40 out of that 70 grams. Now, if you want to look at it on a body weight basis, we've got 33 kilograms at the end of the study versus 30. That's a 1.9 difference in, 2.9 difference in daily gain. And we recover from the 30.1 to 31.9, 1.8 out of that daily body weight loss. And we'll talk a little bit about that after this next slide. Because the question is here, the fact we didn't recover all the performance, does that mean that the fumonisins only partially works? But we get back to the issue of additivity, synergism, and antagonism. What percent of the reduction in performance was due to the fumonisins? Just looking at daily gain, we don't know. So here we go. Sphingolipid on a control diet, 7,000 units. It steps up with more mycotoxins, steps up further with more mycotoxins, with more fumonisin, actually, and up at 60% fines with the highest level of fumonisin, it's blowing away the value at the beginning. When we add the fumonisins to it, that 151,000 is now reduced to 15. That's almost back down to baseline. Sometimes it's more interesting to look at the ratio of sphingolipid to sphingosine. The sphingosine change is a a little bit, but not really much. It's not worth looking at. But looking at the ratio, that starts out low, increases, increases, increases to the highest level, and we add the fumonisins, we're almost back down to baseline. If you look at the increase with the 60% fines, and then you look at the reduction back to baseline, you are removing about 95% of that increase in sphingolipids and the ratio. Based on that, since that is the biomarker, it is being recovered. We would estimate that about 60% of our original loss of performance with these particular mycotoxins at these particular levels was due to the fumonisins. And of that 60%, 57 to 58 out of that 60 is recovered with the growth performance. So fortunately, we have a biomarker. I would say with this, all workers were instructed a biomarker, a visible one, with zearalenone would be enlarged vulvas or reddened nipples. That was not observed at all. Biomarker of DON or vomitoxin is vomiting. That was not observed. But we did have this biomarker for fumonisins, which was affected, which we did restore. So in summation, as corn fines and therefore the mycotoxins in them increased, the pigs did eventually exhibit negative effects. Those corn fines did show on this biomarker a change in that biomarker, and the enzyme Biofix Plus with fumonisins did ameliorate about 95% of those total effects. So thank you very much for the webinar, for coming to the webinar. And Sarah, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you for a great presentation, Merlin. And as he mentioned, we are going to have additional information from Merlin available, and that will be, one spot will be the April digital edition of Feedstuffs. So you'll want to watch for that. You can also probably find it coming up here in the next few days on feedstuffs.com. So let's keep our presentation moving here. We are now going to hear from Deanne Schatzmayr, dsm-firmenich, who will provide more information about fumonisins. Take it away, Deanne.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ladies and gentlemen, also a warm welcome from my side. It's my great pleasure to tell you more about this enzymatic approach that Professor Lindemann has already mentioned in his previous presentation to successfully detoxify fumonisins in swine production. So I will set the scene again with some occurrence data on fumonisins that confirm that these kind of mycotoxins are actually quite prevalent in agricultural commodities. I will then enlarge on some facts that you should know about fumonisins. And lastly, I hope I will be able to impress you with the solution that we can offer to precisely detoxify fumonisins. So all data that I'm going to present in the following are derived from our global mycotoxin survey. This survey comprises actually the longest running data set on mycotoxin occurrence. And it was originally developed for our customers as a special service to support their mycotoxin risk management. And nowadays, it's also used by authorities for mycotoxin risk assessment, and it's also frequently cited in scientific papers. Well, the data that we obtain in this global mycotoxin survey are annually evaluated, and they can be broken down from global to sub-regions or even countries, and also from overall contamination to individual commodities. And what you can see here on this slide is, or are the data that we received for the survey in 2023. And what you can see is that these data once again confirm that mycotoxins are a global threat, and that co-occurrence of mycotoxins is rather rule than exception. And this makes actually mycotoxin risk management and also mycotoxin risk assessment quite tricky. And when you take a closer look at this graph here, you will see that we find that fumonisins are amongst the most frequently occurring mycotoxins worldwide. So globally, in the past 11 years, as you can see here, we found between 50 and 70% of the samples that were contaminated with these specific mycotoxin at concentrations that are actually exceeding the risk threshold that we define for this mycotoxin, which is 500 ppb. And when we now have a closer look at North America, you see that the prevalence of fumonisins in this region is slightly below the global prevalence. However, with an average contamination of more than 2,000 ppb, this region is clearly at risk. Let's now have a closer look at corn and finished feed samples in this region. So fumonisins in corn were found in 66% of all investigated samples and 55% of all investigated finished feed samples. And the concentrations that we found in these samples were quite significant, with almost 2,900 ppb in corn and with still more than 2,000 ppb in finished feed samples. Well, let's now proceed to some facts that you should know about fumonisins. Fumonisins are produced by different Fusarium and Aspergillus species, mainly in hot and moderate climates. So high mycotox or high fumonisin occurrence is usually associated with hot and dry weather that is followed by some periods of high humidity. We can find fumonisins both in food and feed, and for both guidance levels exist in the European Union as well as the US, which actually confirms that these mycotoxins are agriculturally relevant. And when we talk about fumonisins, we are talking about a group of mycotoxins which are structurally very similar, but fumonisin B1 is actually the component that can be considered agriculturally most relevant out of this group. Fumonisins they are hardly bioavailable. That means that only 3 to 4% of this mycotoxin ends up in blood of pigs, and in other animal species it's even less than that. And that explains also that we only find low residues in tissue samples. The majority of fumonisins is excreted via feces, and this makes this specific matrix a very suitable matrix for exposure analysis. Well, fumonisins are able to inhibit the sphingolipid biosynthesis. This was already mentioned in the previous presentation. However, I want to elaborate on that a bit more. Sphingolipids are very important for cell membranes and lipoprotein structures. They are involved in cell recognition and also in signaling. And as fumonisins are in their structure very similar to the sphingolipids, they are able to block, to inhibit this enzyme ceramide synthase. And this in turn leads to an accumulation of these sphingolipids, mainly of sphinganin, but also of sphingosine. And this in turn leads to this increased sphinganin to sphingosine ratio. So in short, fumonisins are able to increase this SASO ratio, and this increased SASO ratio can be used as a suitable biomarker of effect for fumonisins. While fumonisins are known to be neurotoxic, nephrotoxic, hepatotoxic, also carcinogenic, and they are known to suppress the immune system. Pigs and also horses are considered the most susceptible species, so acute exposure to fumonisins can lead to clinical signs in this species, as you can see here on this slide. Well, new scientific findings recently prompted the European Food Safety Authority to revise the reference values on adverse health effects of fumonisins in poultry and also in horses. And this confirms that especially poultry faces a higher fumonisin risk than previously anticipated. Well, one of the most well-known strategies to counteract mycotoxins is adsorption. However, regarding fumonisins, it has to be said that this specific mycotoxin can only be bound to clay binders at low pH values, they get desorbed in the intestinal tract when the pH is increased, and that's the reason why we consider this method not the method of choice for fumonisins. So which alternatives do we have? And this brings me already to the last point of my presentation. With regards to fumonisins, we need biotransformation. So with this technology, a mycotoxin, is biotransformed to a non-toxic metabolite by means of an enzymatic reaction. And this enzymatic reaction is very fast, it's irreversible, and it's very specific. So for fumonisin, it's a fumonisin esterase that is needed to cleave off these two side chains of fumonisins, resulting in hydrolyzed forms that are considered harmless to animals. And the enzyme that we developed, this fumonisin esterase, is called FumZyme. So the development of this enzyme started with the identification of a suitable habitat that showed some detoxification activity against fumonisins, and this habitat was soil. Out of soil, we identified and isolated the responsible strain for fumonisin detoxification. As a next step, we identified the genes that are responsible for this detoxification. We expressed these genes in a suitable expression system, and after that, we did some enzyme engineering in order to increase and to optimize this enzyme with regards to stability and also activity. Well, to investigate this enzyme in studies, in vitro studies and in vivo studies, we had to produce this enzyme in higher quantities, and this was done by fermentation. Well, in 2014, we finally launched this patented technology to precisely detoxify fumonisins in the gastrointestinal tract of animals. And to prove the mode of action or prove the efficacy of such a product, we performed numerous feeding trials. Here you can see a feeding trial that we performed at CQR for registration in the United States. We treated 5 different groups, as you can see here, with 30 animals each. And except for the negative control, all the other groups received fumonisins at a concentration of 6 ppm. And 3 of these toxin-treated groups also received FumZyme, so the enzyme, at 1 of 3 different concentrations. We sampled at 2 time points on day 21 and day 42. On the one hand, feces samples for the mycotoxins for the exposure analysis for fumonisins in feces, and we also sampled blood for biomarker of effect analysis. And here you can see the results that we obtained for the feces analysis. When you look at the left graph first, you see that we obtained a significant decrease of fumonisins in feces of those animals that were treated with the enzyme. And the right graph is actually the proof that the enzyme did what we claim, namely to biotransform the fumonisins to the hydrolyzed forms. So we obtained a significant dose-dependent increase of these hydrolyzed forms in those groups that were treated with the enzyme. And in addition to that, we also checked or looked at the SASO ratio, and we confirmed that this SASO ratio is indeed a suitable biomarker, not only to prove the negative effect of fumonisins, but also to prove the efficacy of an enzyme like FumZyme. What you can see is that FumZyme actually did its job in this trial. It was able to reduce the SASO ratio back to control levels. Well, besides piglet trials, we also performed these biomarker studies in other animal species. Meanwhile, this has already been mentioned, the first and the second product generation of FumZyme received FDA approval as well as EU authorization for pigs and for poultry. And the third product generation is currently under evaluation by the European Food Safety Authority for use in all animal species. So we at dsm-firmenich are quite proud of the fact that we are still the only company with anti-mycotoxin products on market that are approved in the United States and also in Europe. These authorizations can be considered as a benchmark of quality because they more or less confirm the fulfillment of quite rigid and quite demanding requirements on identity, on safety, and also on efficacy of a product such as FumZyme. Well, with this statement, I'm already at the end of my presentation and happy to take any questions that you may have. Back to you, Sarah.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. It is time for questions. So we'd like to ask you to get any questions you have posted. We've got here about 10 minutes. So we're going to have a short question time window. Also, before we get to our Q&A, please turn your attention to the webinar survey that's available in the docket of widgets at the bottom of your screen. We thank you in advance for filling that out. So now on to our Q&A. And let's see, we're going to turn the first question over to you, Diane. That is, since co-occurrence is so common, how does that change how you would think or manage mycotoxins?
Well, indeed, co-occurrence is actually rather rude an exception, as we have seen, and it's practically unavoidable. And as there are actually hundreds of mycotoxins known with a great diversity in their chemical structure and thus also in their behavior, it's quite clear that we have to think about more than only one strategy to counteract these mycotoxins and to manage the risk that is associated with these mycotoxins. However, this is actually independent whether we deal with a single mycotoxin or if we deal with co-contamination. So most anti-mycotoxin products on market are based on adsorption, as I've shown you. If you remember this upside down pyramid that I presented, adsorption is only a working strategy for a very limited number of mycotoxins. Aflatoxins, for instance, are a part of those mycotoxins that can really be adsorbed properly. But for all the other mycotoxins, we have to find alternative strategies. And according to our long-time experience, this biotransformation that I presented, so this precise enzymatic detoxification is actually the best option to choose, as it is also very specific, fast, and irreversible. And I mean, thinking of all the novel mycotoxins that we detect nowadays, and also the knowledge gap that exists with regards to their relevance and also their effects on animals, we could also take some measures that actually strengthen the immune system of animals, also their liver and gut health. And yeah, I think I hope that this answered the question a bit. Thank you.
Very good. So Merlin, the next question is for you, and they are wondering what inclusion rate was the FumZyme in your study that you did with the 60% fines?
Yeah, I thought of that afterward that I didn't double check that, so I don't have the exact number, but it's an important question because just as the detriment or benefit of anything is time and dose dependent, the same way the amount of FumZyme you put in is going to affect the degree of response you get to it. And so in the process of developing the experiment, I was in communication with Dr. Zheng at dsm-firmenich, and we decided on what level to use. And I would recommend that they communicate with dsm-firmenich because they've got a lot of experience and just communicate about what levels you happen to be seeing in your own customers' diets, or if you're a larger integrator in your own, and make a decision based on that. And just to follow on the previous question, I agree. You need multiple strategies for multiple mycotoxins, and while adsorption is a great thing for aflatoxins, for fumonisins, you've got to go with FumZyme. It is the product on the market for taking care of that issue.
So, Diane, how do you know if your mycotoxin program is truly working?
Well, Sarah, that's actually a very good question. Well, to provide a working mycotoxin survey program, I would say you have to provide or to guarantee a quite high number of investigated samples. And this could actually be quite challenging if you think of the fact that we want to evaluate our data on regional and also on commodity level. So when we started our program 20 years ago, we analyzed approximately 1,000 samples per year. And nowadays we are analyzing on average 25,000 samples per year. So this number significantly increased. And furthermore, for a really working program, you have to perform regular screenings, not only to gain more insights in the data, but also to guarantee that the results are representative to the actual situation. And I would say a proof that our program indeed works is that it is, on the one hand, highly accepted and also appreciated by our customers, that it is also requested and used by authorities for mycotoxin risk or mycotoxin risk assessments. And it's also frequently cited in scientific papers.
Very good. So Merlin, back to you. Can gut mucus guard against the effects of mycotoxins in pigs and poultry?
I would say maybe to a degree, but it can be overwhelmed. So it becomes another time dose relationship. And the other thing is, it would depend on the mycotoxin. And we know with the aflatoxins, we can measure a lot of liver enzymes. We know that things are happening, that they've crossed the gut and are having a negative effect. We know the same thing with fumonisins by looking at the sphingosine ratio. So perhaps to a degree, but you can't bank on that for taking care of your risk management in your diets.
Deanne, back to you this is going to be our final question as we're coming up on the hour here. It seems like we're continuing to understand the health impact of mycotoxins. Is there research exploring new areas and diseases of mycotoxin impact?
Well, yes, indeed. In the past decades, of course, a lot of knowledge was gained concerning the negative effects on the agriculturally most relevant mycotoxins. This includes trichothecenes, fumonisins, aflatoxins, zearalenone, and also ochratoxins. However, most of these studies were done with individual mycotoxins and often at very high mycotoxin concentrations. So co-contamination was hardly considered in these studies, and there is actually a knowledge gap on synergistic effects of mycotoxins, especially when it comes to the commonly occurring concentrations. Furthermore, due to analytical methods becoming more and more sensitive, we nowadays detect also numerous novel mycotoxins that I would say to a great extent have not been thoroughly investigated, and that makes it very difficult to evaluate their actual impact in animals. So yes, there are still new research areas to explore with mycotoxins, I would say.
Very good. Well, that is all the time that we have today for questions. We want to thank you so much for your time and expertise today on the topic, all three of our speakers. We also want to thank our sponsor, dsm-firmenich, as well as everyone that has joined us here for this webinar. We appreciate your attention and your participation. Within the next 24 hours, you are going to receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. So you feel free to share those with your colleagues and peers who are not able to join this event. This webinar is copyrighted by Informa from 2024. Presentation materials are owned by and copyrighted by Informa Markets. Individual speakers have been solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our speakers and myself, thank you so much for your time today and have a great one.
Thank you. Thank you.